Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today we're going to be talking about 5 strategies to increase food production in your garden. But before we dive in, I want to do a new listener shout out. So a big hello and thank you to Mark, Shay, Francie, Ivy, Julia, Brendan, Ashley, Mimi, Bruce, and Joby or Jobby. I'm not sure that I said that right. I apologize if I said anybody's name wrong. But thank you for joining. I really appreciate you guys following. And actually to everybody, I really, really appreciate every single one of you joining in every week and listening to the Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs show. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank you all because I recently got notified by Podbean, who is the podcast hosting site that I use, for them to give me a badge that I have reached over 5,000 downloads. So I really appreciate that, and I'm totally blown away. I can't believe that so many people are downloading and listening to this. So thank you for that, and I hope that you're going to find this episode all about 5 strategies to increase food production in your garden just as helpful. So let's dig in. Okay. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and you can probably guess I'm a little bit passionate about it, but that is soil health, okay? Your soil, I said this time and time again, but your soil is the foundation of an amazing organic garden, okay? This is the powerhouse. This is what is going to fuel your plants, which are going to fuel you, okay? It's the fertility of the soil that's going to drive the yield of your garden, okay? And I'm experiencing a, schoolgirl error, right? Or a schoolboy error if you're in England, right? Or a rookie mistake, right? Is what we call that here in the US. I forgot to add some nutrients back to some of my garden beds before I planted, and I'm paying for that now quite heavily because I've got garden beds that are just not performing very well, and it's because I didn't add the fertility back into it, okay? And part of that was for numerous reasons, work-life balance, all of those things, and just plain old, there was just too much to do and I kind of forgot about it. So we all make mistakes, but like I said, the fertility of the soil is going to drive the yield of your garden. Now, if you forget to do that, there are things that you can do to kind of help bring things back. So right now I'm doing a lot of side dressing of my plants with compost. And if you listened to the episode last week, I explained what that was. It's just taking a handful of compost and putting it around the base of the plants. I also am having to use a lot more of my homemade natural fertilizers, which I make on the homestead, than what I would have done in previous years had I actually added that compost onto the garden in spring when I was supposed to. Now, to really determine your soil health, honestly, the easiest way to do it and the most definitive way to do it is to do a soil test, okay? It's not scary. They're very easy to do now, and they're very straightforward and easy to interpret. And doing a soil test will help tell you what amendments you're lacking and what you need to add in. Now, usually you would do your soil amendment in fall or early spring, depending on where you are in the world and depending on your soil type. The easiest way to amend your soil really is adding 2 to 3 inches of compost and digging it in with a garden fork, okay? That's going to work wonders with your soil, whether it's, clay soil or sandy soil. 2 inches of compost is, it makes such a huge difference, okay? There's a reason why we call compost gardener's gold, right? In raised beds, you can spread your compost on top and you can work it in with a hand fork or a trowel, or you can just kind of leave it on the top. Either's fine. Clay soils are going to be best amended in fall, because as you're going to be turning over that soil, you're going to be exposing those clods of clay. And if you're in an area where you get frosts, that freeze thaw action of the water in your soil is going to help break apart those big heavy clay clods. Okay, and adding compost to your soil each year, or well rotted manure. Some people like to use that. Those things are really going to help your soil year after year, and you will see that year after year your garden is going to grow bigger and better because your soil is improving. Okay, so sandy soils are definitely best amended in spring, and that's because they do not hold nutrients very well. Everything just kind of washes away. So in spring we want to be doing it then, because we're going to be getting water runoff and snow melt and those kind of things. So if we amend our soil in spring, then we're going to help to retain some of those nutrients that's in there. Now, compost is amazing because not only does it help break up clay soils, but it helps bind together sandy soils. So those little particulates are going to help stick together with some of the stuff that is in that compost. And well rotted compost is really the best because you can make it yourself. I did an episode all about composting at home, so if you're new to composting, check that out and find out how you can get started. I've also got plenty of posts on the blog all about composting, so you can head on over to www.misfitgardening.com and just type in the search for compost, and there's going to be a bunch of things that come up, so that can help you get started. Now, aside from the fact that, compost, you can make it yourself, it also adds in really important microbes and fungi into the soil that are going to help release more nutrients. And we're learning more as science is progressing that there is this whole, diverse microbiome that is happening in the soil, and there's a lot of these fungi that are connected to the plants and the trees in the surrounding area, and it all helps everything grow together. And we're finding out more and more of these things as people are doing different studies on how things grow and how things are interacting within the ecosystem. So compost contains humus, and it is this stuff that helps to retain moisture in the soil, and a soil that's going to hold on to moisture rather than have it all wash away is going to help hold nutrients for your garden much better. And no surprising that if your soil is holding nutrients better, your plants are going to have an easier time getting hold of those nutrients, and they're going to grow better. Now, the next strategy that I'm going to talk about is pH. Okay, so if you're starting to have flashbacks to science classes, please don't panic. Just know that pH is showing the acidity or alkalinity of the soil, and it's on a scale of 0 to 14, or it's a dark red colour all the way through to a dark purple in colour if you've got like a colour strip. Okay, lower pH values, or those that are red, orange and yellow colours, are meaning an acidic soil, whereas higher pH values, or blue and purple colours, mean a basic or an alkaline soil. Now, a neutral pH is number 7, or it's a light green colour, and most plants grow in a pH range of 5.5 to 7. Okay, and pH is not an indication of soil fertility, and I know there's a lot of misinformation about that, but the pH does affect how easily nutrients are going to become available for your plants. So nutrients are released into the soil by bacteria and microbes and fungi and all that good stuff, all breaking things down. And what happens is those nutrients are dissolved in the water that's available in the soil. So the plant takes up the water and the nutrients as it grows. And nutrients dissolve and become more available when they're in this 5.5 to 7 pH range. Now, some nutrients like your nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and also other nutrients like calcium, magnesium, they're more readily available at other pHs, at different ends of the scale. But for the majority of them, it's this 5.5 to 7 pH range where the majority of things are readily available and things are going to grow the best. Okay. Not sure what I was trying to say there, got a bit tongue-tied. Now, of course, some plants are going to tolerate more acidic or more alkaline conditions, right? So, for example, blueberries tolerate a pH of 4.5 to 5.0, so that's pretty acidic. And asparagus, on the other hand, will tolerate a higher pH. So they go from 6.0 all the way through to neutral to 8.0, so more on that alkaline side. And the only way that you're going to know your soil's pH is to do a soil test, okay? I really don't recommend trying to do like the vinegar and the bicarbonate, testing that I've seen out on there. And sometimes I know you can see by what plants are growing best in an area, might help you give an indication of what your pH is, but honestly, it's just hurting you in the long run, and for the time that it takes you and the money that it takes to purchase a pH soil kit, you can even get soil test kits that have got pH and they do nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus, which is going to help you with your soil fertility anyway. And they're less than $50. I mean, you can pick up like a set that's like a one and done for about $10 or less. But if you do your soil pH, then you know for sure what your pH is. And if you need to raise it up a bit because it's far too acidic, then you can look at adding some agricultural lime onto your soil. If you need to reduce your pH and make it more acidic, then you can look at adding something like flowers of sulfur to do that. And the only way that you're going to know is to do that pH test with your soil and, following the directions of, the application rates on those ingredients. And for those of you that have joined the Grow Your Own Food Academy, there's going to be a new video that's going to be uploaded in the coming weeks, and it's going to walk you step by step through taking a soil test, not only just for pH, but also for nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus, so you can see how it's done and how you interpret the results. So for those of you that are in the academy, make sure that you check that out and check the private Facebook group for those updates when new material is going live. But I can't stress enough that, getting to know your soil and doing a soil test is really going to benefit you in the long run, okay? You're going to waste more time with adding in nutrients that you don't need, whereas you can really drill down into understanding your soil, what it is that you need to be replacing in that, and helping get a better growing garden because of making those changes. Now, we can use the pH information from our soil to help our next strategy, which is companion planting. So using that pH information, we can figure out what some of our preferred ranges to group plants together and grow them based on their soil pH or the nutrients that are needed. And this isn't as complicated as you might think. So if we take our blueberry and asparagus example further up, we might not want to grow those two together because although there's a little bit of overlap between them, like they would actually be much better being grown totally separately, and the two plants are going to grow much better because of that. Now, if we take our friend the blueberry, for example, okay, so the blueberry is growing in a pH of 4.5 to 5.0. Well, cranberries actually also like a soil pH of around there. They grow in a pH of 4.0 to 5.5. So they could happily grow together in the same spot in the garden. You could also grow, something that is non-edible nearby, so like a rhododendron or an azalea or a pyrus. Those are herbaceous plants that grow well also in those kind of low pH or acidic soil conditions. We can also use companion planting in terms of beneficial plantings, and integrated pest management. Okay, and that's something that I learned a lot of when I did my PDC, or my permaculture design course. And if you've been a listener for a while, you might remember the episode with Julie from Giving Ground Seeds, where she talked about planting flowers like marigolds mixed in with your veggies. Okay, the flowers are going to provide a way to attract pollinators and other beneficial insects like predatory insects to help manage pests in the garden. So if you haven't listened to that episode, then please go and check it out, because it's full of, great gardening tips and other complete gems that you can use to help grow your garden. So definitely check that out. But predatory insects are really important because they help manage things like aphids. Okay, and aphids are a problem because they can totally decimate your plants. They can bring in ants who are milking them for their honeydew, and they spread diseases around your garden. Like, aphids are just nasty. And I mean, they're an interesting insect altogether because they can like clone themselves, and the good thing is they're pretty easy to eradicate if you keep on top of them. And that's why one of those things that I talked about, how to keep your garden growing in tip-top condition, is to regularly check your garden, because you want to be checking and monitoring for pests and diseases. But before I get down that lane again, let's talk a little bit about ladybirds, also known as ladybugs. Okay, these are amazing little creatures, and they're great at chomping down aphids. And they love some of the herbs that I grow in my garden, and they love to call those places home. So growing attractant plants, these are things that, help attract predatory insects. So there are things like love edge, dill, bronze fennel. These kind of plants absolutely loved by bees and things like ladybirds, which is where they help to establish a home, especially if it's near a food source where you might have some aphids and things growing. Now, the bonus, of course, with planting herbs is that you can use them in the kitchen, but you can also plant attractant flowers, things like calendula or pot marigold, French marigolds. Those are the ones that help deter pests. Things like yarrow, poached eggplant, nigella or love in a mist, and cosmos are also these amazing beacons to these predatory bugs. And at the same time, if you're planting all these things to attract in the beneficial predators, you're also attracting in the pollinators to your garden. And I can tell you, when I have beehives in the garden, my yields go up massively, because there's so many more pollinators that are working to pollinate those flowers, and especially for those fruiting plants. Okay, the more that you're having those flowers pollinated, the more fruits and harvests that you're going to get. So I got to tell you that I was really freaking excited yesterday because I saw a praying mantis in my garden, and I actually jumped on the video chat app that I used to talk to my parents back in Blighty, because I had to show them this beautiful creature. Now, we don't have praying mantis in England, okay, and the only time that I ever saw a praying mantis when I was growing up there was on the Buffy the Vampire episode where Xander nearly gets eaten by his teacher. And does anyone else remember that episode? Maybe not. Might have been just me, okay? I'm a super nerd. That comes with the territory of being in STEM. So let's just get back to the praying mantis before I embarrass myself further. But those suckers eat like crickets and beetles and all sorts of bugs. And for those of you that are tuning in here in Utah, then you know that those damn crickets are going to be showing up real soon. And we've got to be really good at checking the garden regularly. Otherwise, those crickets are going to eat our tomatoes, our corn, our greens, pretty much everything that we have growing in there. And, I don't like to use pesticides at all in the garden. Even the organic ones, I really hesitate to use. They're a very last resort for me. And that's probably why I've got so many of these interesting predatory insects now showing up, because sometimes we've got to be careful with what even the organic stuff that we're using. They can still cause problems to some of our beneficial bugs. So make sure that if you are going to be using some method of pest control, just really closely read the label to make sure that you minimize the damage to our predatory bugs and pest eaters that are there, because we want to really help to cultivate that ecology and that ecosystem within our garden, where we're having that balance of these predatory insects coming in and eating the pests. And then we're going to have fewer problems with diseases and pest issues on our garden. And other plants that are going to help bring in the good bugs are things like zinnias and sunflowers. They produce like a lot of nectar and things like that. And also, growing low-growing plants or carpeting plants, things like creeping thyme or sweet alyssum, they help to provide places to hide for many beneficial bugs, as well as a great nectar source for those pollinators. So we've covered a little bit about attractants in companion planting and plants that are attractive to, those beneficial bugs. Let's talk a little bit about sacrificial crops or trap crops. So these are plants that we grow near our veggies or plants in the garden that we don't mind being eaten by a pest. Okay, so we grow these plants to attract them away from our crops. Okay, it's like, if you give a kid a giant bowl of broccoli or the other option of a giant bowl of ice cream, which one do you think they're going to go for? It's probably the ice cream, right? So the other way to kind of think of these trap crops is you're providing like a candy store for the pests to come and eat, okay? And we don't mind them eating those things because it's going to help keep them away from the things that we are bothered about. So in the UK, for example, it was really common to grow nasturtiums near our brassica plants, so things like cabbages, broccoli and cauliflower, because the nasturtiums attract the cabbage white butterfly to lay eggs, and they basically get eaten by the caterpillars, helping to leave our cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, all that stuff alone, and somewhat free from damage. Not totally free from damage. You are going to get some that are going to get nibbled on by these bugs, but there's going to be a lot less. So many gardeners plant these trap crops around the border of the growing area, and some plant some of these crops within the row of the crops too. And that was something that Julie from Giving Ground Seeds was explaining, was they kind of intercropped a little bit with some flowers and things to help confuse pests a little bit and bring in these pollinators. So nasturtiums are also great for aphids, black fly, white fly and green fly. Oh my gosh, what is going on with me today? I can't get my words out. Chervil can also help to attract things like slugs and snails. French marigolds can help to attract thrips and nematodes. And radishes can also help attract root fly and flea beetles. And, the only way that you're going to know what's going to work for your garden is to really experiment with trap cropping and see what works for you. So I still grow nasturtiums to this day to help kind of attract some of these things away. I also use, other methods to kind of attract, slugs and snails, for example. So there's the half citrus peelings and stuff, melon slices, those kind of things that you can help attract things like those pill bugs, the roly-poly bugs, slugs, snails, over to this food source, and then you just kind of pick it up and throw them in the trash, and you've kind of taken away a portion of those bugs that are causing issues in your garden. Whereas if you're using a trap crop like nasturtiums, for example, whilst they're being munched on by all these other pests, you could be taking them off by hand and picking off those caterpillars and stuff, or you could be removing the whole plant and taking all those bugs with it and disposing of it. It's really up to you how you want to grow your garden, because I've said before, there are as many ways to grow a garden as there are people on this earth. So that's 7 billion plus. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it. Just do what works for you and do what works for your garden. And I encourage you to make a note of what it is that you've been trying and how it's been performing in your garden journal. All right. The final way that we can use companion planting is to have plants growing which help each other. So, for example, planting carrots with onions is a common one. Okay, the scent of the onions helps to deter carrot fly, and the scent of the carrots and the carrot foliage help to confuse the onion fly as to where the onions are. Some other ones are growing radishes around your cucumber plants. They help to deter cucumber beetles. And growing cucumbers among corn help to deter raccoons because they think that a snake's hiding in there. Because according to my husband, certain snakes, I think it was the water moccasin, smell like cucumber. I don't know. I've not had a lot of experience with kicking about in areas where those things live. So I'm curious if that's really a thing. Let me know in the Facebook group if it is. And of course, many of you might be familiar with the three sisters. So that's growing corn, squash and pole beans together. So the corn is a trellis for the beans lock nitrogen in the soil, which provide a food source for the corn and the squash the squash shades the soil, helping to retain water and reduce weeds. There's lots of great resources all about companion planting, and there's some great books and things that are available. I know I've definitely hooked up one of my favourite books about companion planting in my gardening kit, and the link to that will be in the podcast description, so check that out. Alright, so let's move on to the next one, number 4, which is crop rotation. And rotating your crops basically means planting your veggies in a different position each year. So plants belong in a family. So for example, tomatoes are part of the nightshade family, as are eggplants, peppers and tomatillos. So you wouldn't want to plant eggplant in the same place you were growing peppers, for example, the season before. Or if you were growing tomatillos there or tomatoes there the year before. And this is because nutrient needs in a plant family are very similar. So your soil's going to run out of those essential nutrients for your plants, which is going to cause smaller harvests. It's also going to mean plants are going to be weaker and more susceptible to pests and disease. Practicing crop rotation is also going to help reduce pests and diseases that plants are susceptible to in the soil. So rotating crops can help things like nematodes be reduced, weeds to be reduced, diseases like blight. Those things hang around in the soil for a long time. And by rotating your crops, you're removing those host plants from the area for a period of time. And you can actually reduce the onset of those diseases. So for example, if you were growing tomatoes, you'd want to avoid growing them in the same space for 3, if not 4 seasons, to help give that a really good break and reduce that those blight spores and things that are in the soil. A traditional part of crop rotation is letting a garden bed lay fallow, or not being planted with a vegetable crop and planting a green manure instead. And this is one way how crop rotation can improve your soil structure, okay? Because you can alternate between growing deep-rooted plants and shallow-rooted plants, and you're going to help change your soil texture by doing that. And and a good example would be growing potatoes in a space, and then growing like shallow rooted lettuces in that space the next season, okay? Because you've got the deep rooted digging of your potatoes, and then you've got these shallow rooted lettuces the next year. But using a green manure is kind of it's a newer thing for gardeners to be doing, but it's not new for farmers to be doing, particularly those that are in the organic farming realm. So letting a bed lay fallow, or just having a green manure, planting it on it, it's got a number of benefits, okay? So a mixed green manure produces like a lot of growth, and by a mixed green manure I'm talking like one that's got lots of different things in there. So maybe it's got rye or oats in there, and it's got legumes like field beans or vetch, stuff like that in there, and or clover. And what happens is, you sow these green manures down and then you let them grow, and they actually produce a lot of growth, a lot of biomass, and you can cut that down, that material. You can take it, you can put it in a compost bin, you can mulch the top of a bed with it. Like there's great things that you can do with that. You can also allow that green manure to flower, and that's going to provide, guess what? Food and habitat for those beneficial insects that we talked about earlier. Now, if you're a fan of certain like biointensive gardening methods, then a big portion of your garden's really dedicated to producing biomass for the compost heap. And green manures is a great way to do that. And green manures are typically cut down, right after they flower or just before they flower. You don't want them to run to seed particularly. And then you turn them over into the soil, like with a tiller or by you just kind of getting a border fork in there and turning it over by hand. And what happens is those green manures are going to break down as you're turning them under the soil. You're kind of covering them over so they're not able to keep growing. And they're going to break down and release those nutrients that they pulled up from deeper in the soil. And this is going to help improve your garden bed soil structure and the fertility, which is going to help your garden grow better. Late summer is a really good time to start sowing some green manures because they're also really good at protecting your garden from soil erosion and stuff throughout winter. There's different types of green manures. There's ones that are killed by winter frosts, and there's ones that you sow late in summer. They grow a bit and then they kind of just sort of sit there over winter, and then in spring they grow a bit more, and then that's when you turn them under about 6 weeks or so before you plan on planting in there, because then your soil will have its optimum amount of fertility from those green manures breaking down. So that can be a really good way to help put more nutrients back in your soil if you don't have compost and things readily available. And the last tip that I want to share with you is about growing vertically. Now, growing vertically in your garden is going to help increase food production because you can grow more in the space, right? Vining crops like melons, or pumpkins and squash, they can take up massive amounts of room. But if you're growing them up and over a trellis, you can manage that growth up and away from the garden bed, which means that you've now got space to fill with other crops. And what could be better than that, right? Vertical growing also has got some other benefits. It can help improve air circulation. So if you're in a humid area like my family down in Texas, people down in Florida, my friends in Alabama, everybody there in the deep south, you've got hot and humidity, and guess what? That just loves fungal diseases. So improving your air circulation is going to help you reduce the spread and impact of some of those fungal diseases that you guys are having down there. So if you do live somewhere that is hot and humid and you have a lot of issues with certain fungal diseases, maybe keep the spacing between your plants, even if you're growing vertically. So if you're growing squashes, try to keep those couple of feet between your plants. Don't necessarily be tempted to try and plant more in that space, because you really need that improved air circulation to help reduce the spread and the impact of some of those diseases, because that's going to give your plants a better chance to grow and to be able to get through that. Now, of course, you can also add to that by growing those disease-resistant varieties, so varieties which are able to cope and grow even with some of those problematic diseases that you guys are battling there. And, do some research. Many of you, especially here in the US, there's all these agricultural extension officers at the universities, and they are so helpful in, letting you know what the diseases are that are prevalent in your area. And many of them also include recommended varieties. I know I was checking out the one in Texas, looking at certain areas that we may or may not be considering moving to at some point. But they had so much information there, and there was even, recommended varieties for growing in that area. So definitely check out your nearest agricultural extension office. And, if the information isn't there that you're looking for, don't be afraid to pick up the phone and ask somebody, or send them an email. Okay, that's what they're there for. They're there to help answer some of those questions that you have for the area that you're living in. FYI, a lot of extension officers do things like checking pressure canners, checking the gauges and making sure that they're working appropriately as well. And some even do soil testing services. So definitely do a little bit of research and see what's available at yours. Now, back to growing vertically, you can also make extra space. You can make use of things like hanging baskets to grow strawberries. There's also those fancy upside down planters for cherry tomatoes. When I was a kid, that was like the most amazing thing ever, seeing a tomato growing upside down. Like my brain couldn't figure it out, because it was like, but it's got to grow in the ground and the ground's down. So, if you have kids and you want to do something interesting for them as like a science project or whatever, growing tomatoes upside down might be kind of cool for them. You can even make use of space like a wall that gets sunshine, especially if you've got drip irrigation. You could hook up some guttering with stoppers on either end so you don't lose the soil, and lettuces will grow quite happily in those. There's also, I've seen people with like really neat aquaponic systems or hydroponic systems against a wall, where they've got PVC piping that they've drilled holes in, and they're growing plants in those as well. And it's amazing how much more you can grow by growing up like a ladder. So those strategies are going to help you make use of additional space that you might not necessarily be using to grow food. But you don't have to grow food in those situations. I mean, I like hanging baskets for growing flowers in. I have done peppers in them before, and my auntie even sent me a picture of her growing herbs in them before. But if you want to keep them for growing flowers and stuff, that's cool too. They're going to all improve your garden, because flowers are going to attract those pollinators into the garden anyway, and as they're visiting those, they might see on the way, oh, look at all these other things that are here that are a great food source, and then they'll go back to the hive and tell their fellow worker bees to come and visit your yard. So I would love to know which of these strategies you're going to be doing in your garden and how you're going to improve your gardening skills for next year. So let me know in the Facebook group. I'll pop a link in the podcast description so you can join. Just make sure that you fill out all of the questions that are there. Otherwise you won't be accepted into the group. Until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully and that you enjoy all the time that you're having on your homestead.